And good afternoon. Welcome back once again to Bloomberg Opinion Editorial Board Conversations. I'm your host, Robert George. I'm very honored to have back my friend and colleague, Nisid Hajari, who is here to discuss what is really the story of the week, if not the month, the Afghanistan withdrawal and the way it was handled and the long-term impacts of it. So Nisid, welcome back.
Thank you, Robert. Good to be here.
So a lot to talk about. You know, we all saw the awful scenes this past weekend of Afghanistanis rushing to be helped ushered out of the country, and basically the fall of the American presence there. Rather than rehash that part of it. I'd like to try and take a look at, sort of A, how we got there, and B, how to look forward. So I guess the initial question I'd want to talk about is it was very, very clear that, the Trump administration was negotiating a settlement, withdrawal structure with the Taliban for a year or more. President Biden suggested that the original date of May, which was then pushed back to August, was not something that could be pushed back again. Was that the right kind of an approach? Or given what the Taliban did in terms of negotiating their own side deals in the provincial capitals and so forth, was there a window that the U.S. could have continued negotiating with the Taliban that the Biden administration didn't take advantage of?
Well, I don't think they didn't push terribly hard, right? I mean, it was very clear that President Biden wanted to leave. He wasn't looking for an excuse to stay. You could argue that they could have extended this and set a date at the end of the year, or not even set a firm date, but sort of based on conditions. And there's a ready argument. The Taliban had not arguably fulfilled their end of the bargain, at least as we might have interpreted it, which is maybe a little different than they interpreted it. But they had not engaged in good faith negotiations with the Afghan government. They had not cut ties to Al Qaeda and so on. So we did have that argument on our side. Now Biden is right that they would most likely then have said, you've violated the agreement. It's now off, and we will attack U.S. soldiers again. There is an argument, we hear a lot now, saying, well, that would have been preferable to where we are now, that the U.S. over the last couple of years has taken very few casualties there. Troop numbers were down to 2,500, and that we should have just stayed like that indefinitely to prevent the scenes that you're seeing now. But what people forget when they say that is that when Trump signed that deal in February of 2020, we had 13,000 troops in the country, not 2,500. That was the number that had sort of created the stalemate. And the stalemate was not static, right? I mean, the numbers of Afghan civilian casualties were skyrocketing. And because we were relying more on airstrikes and so on. And that number would have kept going up. That would have posed a problem for us over the long term. The Taliban were also still gaining ground, even if Americans weren't being killed. So, if we had our finger in the dike was already leaking. So nobody should act as though there was a perfect situation and we could have just maintained this indefinitely at zero cost.
Right, exactly. So is the fact that, as you pointed out, the casualty rate on the Afghanistan side was steadily increasing, or was just ongoing. From your analysis, is that a reason why when the Taliban just basically started advancing on the provincial capitals, that they were able to just basically go in, without firing a shot? Did that suggest that? It's an odd way to put it. Does that suggest that the diplomacy on the Taliban side, vis-a-vis the Afghan cities and so forth, was energized and focused, and seemed to have caught the U.S. off guard?
Yeah, no, their local diplomacy was quite effective, and their strategy was quite effective. They had a few things going for them. This has been true over the last 20 years. This isn't the first time Afghan military units have surrendered to the Taliban in specific instances. They have, or sort of shrunk away from a fight. Now, they have also fought very bravely, and 66,000 of them were killed. So we shouldn't minimize that sacrifice by any stretch. But people, our Afghan army units effectively have had less to fight for in some ways than the Taliban. The Taliban are fighting to defend, as they see it, to defend Islam and to defend their country against foreign occupation. The Afghan army is fighting for a paycheck. Their leaders were not terribly inspiring. They were terribly corrupt. And there's no getting around the fact that they were associated with an outside power, with the U.S. That was causing. The Taliban caused many more civilian deaths than the U.S. did by far. But we were portrayed as causing these airstrike casualties, and it can be hard to maintain morale in those circumstances.
One of the more surprising things, I think, over the last couple of days has been that the Taliban, I guess, over the Taliban that we're seeing now does not seem to be the Taliban of 20 years ago. They seem to be, modernized, apparently willing to, or at least seeking to curry international support. They've talked about the fact that they will respect women's rights, within the proviso of Islam. What is going on there? Does it look like they are trying to become? Have they learned certain lessons over the last 20 years in terms of working with the global community?
Well, I think what they learned was that it is going to be very difficult for them to succeed without some degree of international support and legitimacy and aid and investment. The isolation that they suffered in their first regime made it very hard to govern. They also did not have the expertise needed to govern, and they still don't now. So they are certainly trying to portray this more moderate image in order to convince countries, and maybe they won't convince all of them. They might not convince the U.S., but if they convince China and Russia to recognize their government and provide support, that's what they're aiming for. Now, I think everybody understands that it's you can't be naive about this. That we need to wait and see what their behavior is. It's entirely possible, if not likely, that the Taliban political leadership, who are a bit older, who had positions in the previous government and so on, they may have changed their position and may sort of enjoy the newfound international legitimacy that they've had flying around to these various capitals and meeting with foreign ministers and so on. But as you see right now on the ground, the rank and file, these are 18, 20-year-old kids with Kalashnikovs, and discipline doesn't extend all the way down to the ground level. So it's going to be messy, and I think a lot of what they do is still going to be anathema to Western countries. But at the same time, they are saying these things, and we need to hold them to it. The international community needs to do what it can to hold them to these promises.
What should we expect? Part of the confusion and the chaos of Afghanistan over the last couple of decades, if not the last few centuries, is this tension, obviously, between groups that are religiously infused as well as culturally. There's also been the warlord issue. Is that something that the Taliban themselves need to own right now? Are these warlords, are some of them aligned with the Taliban? Are some of them opposed? What's that going to look like in the coming years?
I think it's really uncertain right now. Some of these warlords, these ethnic militias that it was believed that they would take up arms and fight back against the Taliban, perhaps even more passionately than the Afghan army, they also melted away under the Taliban onslaught. Some left the country, some were under house arrest right now. I think the Taliban, if they're smart, and some of them clearly are, will understand that they cannot govern the country the way they tried to do it before, where it was only a Pashtun government, essentially. That there are other ethnicities in Afghanistan who need some degree of representation and some degree of local autonomy. They need to be, I wouldn't call it a power sharing agreement, because the Taliban would completely dominate any government that's set up now, because they did win militarily. But they would be wise to bring in other players, other figures that have influence in different parts of the country over different communities, if they want to have any hope of stability. You're already seeing, it's just been a few days, you're already seeing anti-Taliban protests in a couple cities in the east and the south. So, that you don't see insurgency growing right now, and I'm not even sure that that's what Afghans want to see, is more fighting, but trying to dominate a centralized government with one ethnic group is not going to work, and it never has in Afghanistan.
We saw in the last day or so, China announced that they were, willing to recognize the Taliban as the rulers of the country, and wanting to get into some kind of a relationship with them. When we last talked about this a few months back, we were talking about the influence of Afghanistan's various neighbors, and given that, what is the, obviously, President Biden talked about the cost of staying, but what is the cost of the U.S. withdrawing from there, and China and presumably Russia and others seemingly willing to come in and go into a partnership with Afghanistan?
Well, I mean, I think there's definitely a cost to U.S. credibility because of the way things unfolded here, and the way we seem to have ignored our allies, and the way we seem to have dropped our support for the Afghan government, and so on. But I wouldn't exaggerate it, and I also wouldn't exaggerate the potential for China to somehow swoop in and start mining minerals and building roads to Pakistan through Afghanistan, and benefiting economically for this. I mean, Afghanistan for China is first and foremost a security problem. They're not looking at this as an economic opportunity in the first instance. That the minerals are there, they are extremely hard to get out, and they're never going to be mined if security isn't established across the country. So the Chinese, they haven't actually recognized. I mean, there is no government to recognize yet. They haven't formally recognized a new Afghan government. And they are still saying that they want to see a more broadly representative government. And their main interest is that the Taliban prevent any sort of extremism that might affect China or Chinese interests in Pakistan or elsewhere. And just the same way that the US can't trust Taliban promises about cutting off ties to Al-Qaeda, I don't think the Chinese would be wise to trust Taliban promises about cutting off ties to extremist groups that target Pakistan or China. I mean, this is going to be a problem for them just as much as it is for us, I think.
Okay, as we finish up here, the one goal we had 20 years ago in terms of going into Afghanistan was to expel Al-Qaeda, and to create a framework where it made it harder for radical extremists to create a platform with which to attack the U.S. 20 years later, given the rather catastrophic intelligence failure that the United States had in terms of not anticipating how fast the Taliban would be able to take over the country, can Americans feel confident that we have enough intelligence resources to make sure that Afghanistan doesn't become another staging ground for Al-Qaeda or ISIS or other such organizations?
Well, it was always going to be hard. I mean, some of the reassurances we've gotten from the administration about how they have these over-the-horizon capabilities and they can take out terrorists from anywhere, anywhere on Earth, that some of that was exaggerated. That this was always going to be difficult if we didn't have forces on the ground, and if we didn't have friendly forces on the ground. We don't have a government or a military to work with in Afghanistan now, and we don't have bases in regional countries where we can fly drones from or stage special operations strikes from. So you're reduced for the moment to flying missions from the Gulf, and you can only do so much with that. It's not like huge groups of Al-Qaeda terrorists are suddenly going to appear in the open, and build a training camp that we can bomb. This is going to be a very hard intelligence work, and it is now going to be harder. I don't think it's impossible, and I think it's a problem that we deal with in all different parts of the world, and we'll just have to deal with it here too. And we'll also have to build up our own resilience, because if there is another attack, and we'll just have to be able to survive it and go after the people who did it and so on. But we can't ignore that part of the equation either.
And on that somber, not reflective note, I guess we'll just leave it there. Nisid Hajari, thank you once again for joining us, and thank you all for once again tuning in to Bloomberg Opinion Editorial Board Conversations. I'm your host, Robert George, and we'll see you again next week.